I'd like to continue our discussion of chapter 9 of the Gospel of Matthew and take a look starting at verse 23. Jesus has just done a healing of a woman who had been hemorrhaging for 12 years. And then in verse 23 it says, when Jesus arrived at the official's house and saw the flute player and the crowd who were making a commotion, he said, "Go away, girl is not dead, but sleeping." And they ridiculed him. So Jesus now arrives finally after healing the woman with the hemorrhage at the house of the official. And when he gets there, he sees quite the scene. There's flute players with some music. There's a crowd. And Jesus tries to get rid of them. He thinks they are a distraction. And he says, the girl is not dead. She's just sleeping. So Jesus gives them a little clue as to what he will do in terms of his miracle, that this girl is not going to remain dead. But the reaction of the crowd is amazing, right? They just ridicule Jesus. Jesus, what are you talking about? The girl is obviously dead. She's been dead for a while. She's not moving. There's no question that she is dead. So from Matthew's point of view, the way Matthew is telling the story, she is certainly dead. And the crowd gives that message to Jesus. Now, of course, we could ask, well, how many in this crowd really know who Jesus is? Have they heard of Jesus? You would think perhaps they would have heard something because the official has gone to seek Jesus. So you would think maybe he would have made this known and the crowd would have been aware of this. But in any case, their reaction is to belittle Jesus. Flute players, very interestingly, flute players were prescribed for even the poorest of Jews. So if there was a funeral service, a wake for someone, if they were preparing for the burial, there would be flute players. We see this in the Mishnah. The requirement is for there to be two flutes and a lamenting woman. So this is even if someone is very poor, this should be provided as a sign of mourning. When Jesus says sleeping, dead but not, she's not dead but sleeping. Sleeping is really a biblical metaphor for death. Many times that's referred to as a person is dead, they're sleeping. Jesus' statement is not a denial of the child's real death, but an assurance that she will be released from the sleep of death. So Jesus is not saying she isn't dead, he's just saying that there's going to be something happening here where I will awake her from that sleep of death. So Jesus is giving them a sense of the miracle, what the miracle will be about. We see this in Psalm 88, verse 6. My couch is among the dead, with the slain who lie in the grave. You remember them no more, they are cut off from your care. So those who are in the grave are similar to those who are on the couch. They're sleeping. This is a way to speak about death. So Jesus, when he says that she's sleeping, is really, in a way, saying that she is dead, but giving some indication of what is going to happen. In verse 25, the story progresses, and we hear when the crowd was put out, he came and took her by the hand, and the little girl arose. So we see the personal touch of Jesus. Jesus takes this little girl by the hand, shows his tenderness, his love for her. Both Elijah in 1 Kings 17, 17 to 24, and Elisha in 2 Kings, chapter 4, verse 32 and 37, they demonstrated the power to resuscitate those who had died. So this is not something that was foreign to the Jewish tradition. In the scriptures, this had been mentioned that there were prophets who had this power to bring back to life those who were dead. And then it says in verse 26, and then news of this spread throughout all the land. So as you can well imagine, this is not something that one could keep quiet. It was spread quickly. Matthew's presentation of these stories is very interesting in the sense that it contrasts very much with Mark's, the way Mark presents it. In Mark, the power to heal the woman with the hemorrhage just emanates from Jesus instantly. In Matthew, the healing power comes from the word of Jesus. So the idea of the healing is interesting, that it is Jesus and his word that really effectuates that healing. In Mark, it just seems to come forth as the woman touches the garment of Jesus. But in Matthew, Matthew makes a deliberate emphasis on the power of the word of Jesus. In Mark, there was a healing of the official's son. In Matthew, it is a resurrection story that is going to parallel the resurrection of Jesus in several details. So it's interesting that Jesus is, in this story, getting us ready for his own resurrection from the dead. The fact that in some ways, in the tomb for those 3 days, Jesus is just preparing for the resurrection. This is a good example of really the development of the stories of the deeds of Jesus and how that development was experienced in the primitive church. So sometimes these stories developed as they were told to emphasize really different aspects of the ministry of Jesus. Then the next story we see in Matthew is a very interesting one about the healing of 2 blind men. So we've seen the woman with the hemorrhage healed. We saw the paralyzed man healed. We saw the daughter raised from the dead. Now we see 2 blind men, and we see this in verse 27. And as Jesus passed on from there, 2 blind men followed him, crying out, "Son of David, have pity on us." So a couple of things to note here. It's not one blind person, but 2 that Jesus is dealing with. And their use of the term Son of David. Son of David was always taken as a messianic title. It's a messianic title that Matthew connects with the healing power of Jesus. And really, it is Matthew's favorite messianic title. So when there is a healing, many times we see that. And so this title, Son of David, what is it saying? It's saying we are dealing here with the Messiah. Jesus is the one who has been promised. He is the Messiah. We see this in Matthew 12:23, Matthew 15:22, Matthew 20:30 to 31. This is similar in some ways to the healing of Bartimaeus, but here there are 2 blind men in Matthew's version of the healing in chapter 9 and chapter 20. So when he entered the house, the blind men approached him, and Jesus said to them, "Do you believe I can do this?" "Yes, Lord," they said to him. Interesting. Jesus asked them about the status of their faith. So the importance for the healing of the faith in Jesus is brought out. Then he touched their eyes and said, "Let it be done to you according to your faith." Again, Jesus emphasizing in the story the importance of faith. And then in verse 30, and their eyes were open, Jesus warned them sternly, see that no one knows about this. So Jesus wanted to make sure that this wasn't spread. The admonishing to silence is a theme that is very prevalent and pronounced in Mark. We see it somewhat in Matthew, but certainly a lot more in Mark. And interesting, of course, a little sense of humor here in verse 31. But they went out and spread word of him throughout all that land. So Jesus, don't spread it, don't spread it. And immediately they go out and they spread it. Just such good news. They wanted to let other people know what Jesus had done. So here we see very carefully the healing power of Jesus and the relationship of faith. We saw faith from the woman with the hemorrhage. We saw faith from those who brought the paralyzed man to Jesus. We saw faith in the officials who came for the healing of his daughter and entreated Jesus. And now the importance of faith in terms of these two blind men kind of relates to us in terms of our own faith. How much faith do we have in Jesus? How much trust do we have in Jesus? Certainly, this theme of faith is a very important theme. And so it helps us to reflect in terms of our own life. How much faith do we have in Jesus?